Welcome to the programme. Ukraine says it's reached an agreement with Russia to allow some civilians to leave the devastated port of Mariupol. The Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister says the plan involves a humanitarian corridor for women, children and the elderly. There's been no word yet from the Kremlin. Much of Mariupol has been levelled by relentless Russian bombardment. A deadline set by Russia for the remaining Ukrainian fighters in Mariupol to surrender has passed. Elsewhere, there are reports of thousands trapped in the city of Izium, known as the gateway to the Black Sea. From Lviv in western Ukraine, our correspondent Dan Johnson sent us this report.
This massive steelworks is still the last stand of Ukraine's resistance in Mariupol. Russian forces have repeatedly tried to storm it, and they've laid down another deadline to surrender. Ukrainian soldiers are holding out, but they're getting desperate.
This is our appeal to the world. This could be the last appeal of our lives. We are probably facing our last days, if not ours. The enemy is outnumbering us 10 to 1. They have advantage in the air, in artillery, in their forces on land, in equipment and in tanks.
There's a new agreement to get more residents out of the bombarded city, but previous attempts have been only partly successful. Around 100,000 are still trapped. Last night, Russia says it hit more than 1,000 military targets across the country. Ukrainian defences have been successful in stopping some attacks, but the president again appealed for more weapons.
It is unfair that Ukraine is still forced to ask for what its partners have been storing for years. If they have the weapons Ukraine needs, if they have the ammunition we need, it is their moral duty to help protect freedom.
International support is helping the war's refugees as well. These are temporary homes brought to Lviv from Poland. Aliona showed me where she and baby Yaroslav now sleep after they left their town near Dnipro. She's one of the people of Ukraine's east who've grown weary of constant conflict.
In 2014, we thought the war would last a week. Then it lasted a month, then a year, and now it's been going for 8 years. We tried to live through the 2014 war like normal people, trying to get by, trying not to think about it. But now war has come after us again.
This is a sign that accommodation here has now started to run short. And while this is a good short-term option, the question is how long can families live like this? And as the fighting moves further west, the likelihood is this will be a reality for even more people. The Ukrainians released these pictures of their front lines to show they're digging in and ready to fight. Although some ground has been lost to the Russians in the east, they have had some early success in holding back this new offensive in the battle for Donbass. Dan Johnson, BBC News, Lviv.
Well, Dr. Samir Atta is a Syrian-American doctor who has just returned from treating patients in Kiev and Kharkiv. He previously provided medical assistance in Aleppo during the war in Syria, also treating victims of Russian ordnance. He joins us now from his home in Chicago. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. We often, since this conflict began in the last 7 weeks, have been seeing comparisons to Grozny, but comparisons also to Syria where you work. You've just come back from Kiev and also from doing some work in Kharkiv. Just tell us what you saw and who you treated.
I spent 2 weeks in a Kiev hospital and 1 week in Kharkiv, and mainly I was treating civilians, and the brunt of it was just war wounds. So a lot of amputations, a lot of broken bones, and just the graphic, horrible injuries you'd see in any war. So disfigured faces, disemboweled bellies, just sights you hope nobody ever really has to see.
And these are things that you saw in Syria as well?
Yeah, they're the same exact war wounds, ballistic injuries, high energy explosives. They all affect the human body the same, and you have to treat them the same way.
And I suppose many people have been talking about Russian tactics, the targeting of densely populated areas, places where civilians mostly live. Is that the kind of thing that you're seeing as well, especially in Kharkiv, when we were seeing a lot of the residential areas being targeted?
That's what it seemed to me. I mean, the day before I arrived, a market was hit 100 meters from the hospital, and it injured 15 people. The hospital was overwhelmed with multiple wounded. One of their nurses was killed in the attack along with her 2-year-old grandson. And then the day I left, the hospital was hit too. It blew out a bunch of windows, and everyone was okay, but obviously that's still a very hostile, threatening environment. And it's the same, I guess, the same sort of tactics I saw in Syria. It's the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and civilian infrastructures, with the intent to terrorize, with the intent to take away hope and cause as much damage as possible.
Yeah, and again, if we're looking at comparisons with Syria, I mean, in a lot of ways, medical facilities were targeted there as well. Hospitals were struck, and places where people were being treated for their war wounds.
Yeah, and I got to Syria. My first mission was a couple of years after the war started. So by that point, the infrastructure was cut. The medical infrastructure was demolished. We were doing operations in a basement with not much anesthesia, not much equipment. At least here, the war has only here been about 2 months, and the infrastructure is still intact. But the fear and the anxiety and the uncertainty, it's still there. I mean, when you're in a hospital and you're operating and the hospital is shaking from bombs and the windows are getting blown out and your colleagues are dying, and you're hearing stories of other people from other cities where that are sieged and cut off from water and electricity. That threat is real, and it's always there, hovering over as you work.
Yeah, and in the back of your mind, I suppose, because as a doctor, you go there to do your job, to save lives, to treat patients, to see some of the most horrific things. But at the same time, your own safety is something that you have to constantly be thinking about as well, because just because you're in a hospital doesn't mean you're safe.
Yeah, and you bear witness to that. You bear witness to that fear and that horror and that gravity and that uncertainty. But also, the best part about any hospital, whether you're in a basement in Aleppo or in a hospital in Kiev or Kharkiv, it's not the shape of the building or the equipment. It's really the people you're with, in the sense of community and sense of spirit. And that's what got me through Syria, is the Syrian doctors and nurses who I worked with. And it's the same sort of courage and compassion and mentality and resilience that I saw amongst Ukrainian doctors and nurses, and even the janitors. Everyone lives in the hospital. They all live as a family in a community. They eat together. They live in their offices because it's too dangerous to go home, or their homes have been destroyed, or they're occupied by the Russians. And so that's what gets you through that, is the sense of a family and a community.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose that the kind of injuries you were seeing, and I know that you're not a bombs expert, but there are a lot of accusations of cluster bombs being used on civilian populations. I mean, were you seeing very similar things in Kharkiv as you were in Syria and places like Aleppo?
I was. I mean, the wounds looked the same to me. Just traumatic amputations where arms and legs get separated from the body. You'd see. I remember a veterinarian that was just pockmarked with shrapnel and munitions from head to toe, and a 20-year-old girl missing her right leg, and her left leg was broken. And again, same pattern. She's just pockmarked with shrapnel, and she's just stuck in a hospital because war surgery is never one and done. When you have that amount of explosive and munitions coming at you, it's not just one surgery. It requires multiple surgeries to get a wound clean and then closed. And it's the same sort of stuff I was seeing in Aleppo.
And how much more difficult does your job become? Because it's not just about a normal surgery. You're dealing with extreme trauma.
Yeah, there's the psychological aspect to it as well. I mean, you bear witness to immeasurable suffering, and you're working in a hostile environment, often with limited resources. And yeah, you fear for your safety, but more importantly, you fear for the safety of your patients. And you'd hear air sirens, you'd hear explosives and shelling going on outside. And there are patients stuck on the 3rd and 4th floor with amputated limbs, broken bones, and they can't run down to the basement bunker. So the attitude there was, if their patients were stuck, a lot of the doctors, when the air raid sirened, they just kept working. They carried on because they were just going to stick it out with their patients. If their patients are stuck, they're going to stick it out with them. And again, it comes back to that solidarity and sense of community. But yeah, you're always worried you may find yourself on the, being treated as a patient working in those hospitals, because you're there to help, but you feel like a target some days.
Dr. Samir Atta, thank you so much for joining us here on the program, and thank you for all of the work that you do.
Thank you very much.